So welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about job attitudes, attitudes, internal feelings, thoughts that we have about our job, and we're going to be talking about different types, and we're going to be talking about different ways that we can look at basically trying to have employees have more positive attitudes towards their job. But one of the first things to really consider before we even start talking about the different types of job attitudes that we're going to discuss is that one of the important things that researchers have to do is they have to get construct validity of attitudes. So attitudes can't be measured directly. We measure attitudes through questionnaires, through observations, and when we're looking at attitudes, when we label something job satisfaction, well, we need to define it and we need to determine how we're going to measure it. And if we're wanting to look at additional attitudes, let's say organizational attractiveness or organizational commitment, we need to be able to also establish that that new attitude is separate and different from something we're already measuring. So there's a lot of different attitudes we have about our work. However, what we're going to be talking about is basically validated measurements of attitudes that have been found to be kind of unique and explaining specific parts of behavior in the workplace. And as we talk about these different major constructs of job attitudes that are used in the research, realize that that doesn't mean that they're the only types of attitudes that there are in the workplace. It's the ones that are clearly defined, have been shown to be fairly reliably and validly measured, and are somewhat distinct from each other. So, in our discussion of job attitudes, we're really going to be focusing on the antecedents and the consequences. So basically, all the models that we're going to be talking about basically are going to be models where the actual attitude itself is in the center of the model. And what I mean by that is that we're going to first start talking about all of the antecedents, or things that cause the attitude. So these would be things that could increase the attitude or decrease the attitude. So for example, job satisfaction. What elements in a workplace result in more or less job satisfaction? In other words, we're going to be talking, when we talk about antecedents, we're talking about things in the environment of an organization or a job that could be changed either by the organizational structure or how management treats the employees or the nature of the job. It's movable objects, in other words. It's things that we can take control of if we want to result in higher job satisfaction. In the middle of all these models is going to be that and. So antecedents are the causes, things that we could actually adjust in a workplace that would result in the attitude changing. The attitude is in the middle of that model, and it's basically what we're measuring. We're just measuring that attitude. But what we're hoping that attitude is then related to is the consequences. So the antecedents result in the attitude. The attitude then results in the consequences, and the consequences are usually organizational outcomes. For example, reduced absenteeism, reduced turnover, increased productivity, increased OCBs, organizational citizenship behaviors. Those are going to be the consequences. So when we're talking about job attitudes, we're really going to be focusing on what can we change in a workplace to affect the attitude, and then what does that attitude affect that the organization would care about. So what are attitudes and why are job attitudes important? So an attitude is a degree of positive or negative feelings a person has towards a particular person, place, or thing. So when we're talking about an attitude, our definition for any attitude is that an attitude can be both positive, neutral, or negative. So it is a affective or emotional state. And it can be, you can have a very positive attitude about something, you can have a very blah attitude towards something, you can have a very negative attitude towards something. I have a negative attitude towards mushrooms. I'm not very fond of mushrooms. I have a neutral attitude when it comes to most actual green vegetables. Peas, lima beans, etc. Could take them or leave them. I have a very positive attitude towards grapes. I love grapes. So each one of those is an attitude. Now notice each one of them also had a target. So when we talk about an attitude, the first thing we need to determine is it a positive or negative, and how strong is that attitude? So an attitude can range from very strongly negative through general neutral feelings all the way to very positive, very strongly positive. The other thing that defines an attitude is that it has a target, that attitude is targeting a particular person, place, or thing. So generally speaking, when we're looking at job attitudes, what we're focusing on is hopefully positive attitudes towards the organization, towards the job, towards their coworkers. Job attitudes are important. So job attitudes have been shown to be a strong influence of work behavior, especially in jobs where there is some latitude and control of how you do your work. So again, if you're in a very controlled environment where basically performance has very little variance to it, you're in a factory assembly line, you have to do your job, and to do your job is to do X things per hour. And if you do less than that, you're actually most likely fired, and you can't do more than that because the machinery doesn't go any quicker. In that case, job attitudes may predict turnover, they may predict absenteeism, they may predict counter work behaviors. They probably won't be that tied to actual performance because performance is so tightly controlled. When the employee has some latitude in performance, that's when job attitudes have a lot of influence on how someone's doing their job. So for a very specific example of this, I'm recording this lecture on December 24th, the morning of Christmas Eve. I've come into my workplace. I'm probably the only person in the building. I'm in my office doing this lecture right now. And I don't have anything scheduled family-wise till later in the day, so that was one factor. But I could easily have just stayed in and taken the day off. But I actually really like my job. I have a very high level of job satisfaction. I like what I do. And I was actually like, I'm going to go ahead and get another lecture done today. So again, I'm going a little above and beyond. I'm performing a little bit more than would normally be expected because of my positive job attitude. In a job that I have a lot of latitude to, I could have easily just said, I'm just going to wait till next week and I'll still get this lecture done in time for the students to listen to it. But I decided to just do it today. So, improving job attitudes is a desirable goal. So, since there's been strong studies that have found that even in very tightly controlled jobs, job attitudes do still influence outcomes like turnover, like absenteeism, like counter workforce behavior, improving job attitudes is a very desirable goal. There is clear proof that happier workers, more satisfied workers broadly are going to be more likely to stay with the company, less likely to be absent, less likely to be wasting company time doing things they shouldn't be doing, and generally will also perform better. They can also help us understand the complexities of work and non-work life. So one of the major areas of interest in organizational psychology, especially in the last 10, 20 years, is the idea of work-life balance, the idea that work and life both exist in someone, and when I say life, I mean non-work, family, personal time, that people need to balance these two goals, these two expectations, and that organizations that help them do this also usually are organizations that are seen in a more positive light. So the first thing that we need to recognize when we start talking about attitudes is that attitudes, we have a tendency to believe that attitudes are directly related to behavior. The idea that if you have an attitude about something, that means that that's how you're always going to behave, that we believe we act on our attitudes. The reality is that attitudes are just a small part of a pretty long behavioral chain of events that leads to behavior. So, for instance, we all can think of examples where we had fairly strong attitudes that we failed to act on. We may have been in a situation where we felt uncomfortable and we thought back on it and gone, why didn't I say something? Why didn't I stop that situation? One of my previous examples, I mentioned the fact that I really don't like mushrooms. If I can avoid them, I will. But there's many times where I'll eat mushrooms. I like to go out, I like to try different foods, and sometimes I'll order something brand new at a restaurant, and when it arrives, there's mushrooms on it. I don't not eat that. So I have a strong attitude about mushrooms, but it doesn't always result in behavior. In fact, at one point, my wife actually saw me kind of turning my nose up to some mushrooms, and she looked very confused. This was fairly early in our relationship, because she's like, what was that about? I'm like, well, I hate mushrooms. And she's like, you hate mushrooms? I see you eat them a lot. And I'm like, well, if I order something and they're in them, I'm not going to remove them because the chef thought they should be a part of the meal. And she just looked at me somewhat confused. But that's, again, an example of how an attitude doesn't always become a behavior. So attitudes are one part of three things that doesn't even lead directly to behavior. It leads to intentions. So attitudes, subjective norms, and perceived behavioral control affect our intentions to behave in a certain way that affects behavior. So let me just walk through this. And this is called the theory of planned behavior, and it is very strongly supported by cognitive research, social research, and organizational research. So let's say I have an attitude. And that attitude is, I want to lose weight being less weight is important. I want to be healthier. I want to lose 20 pounds. I feel very strongly about this. Okay, so there's the attitude. Now, if the attitude alone was guiding my behavior, it should be very clear I should be in the gym every day and I should be watching what I eat. But then we have subjective norms. Subjective norms refers to basically what's going on in the environment around me. So let's say that I have that strong attitude, but my family and my close friends all don't believe in dieting. All of them don't worry about their health. They eat whatever they want. They go out to ice cream regularly. That's the norms that are happening around me, which means my attitude is now in direct conflict with the norms of behavior of all of the people around me. And we are very social creatures. It is hard to buck subjective norms. Finally, perceived behavioral control. This is similar to self-efficacy that we were talking about in the motivation chapter. So this is the idea that, do you think that you actually can control your behavior? So someone might have a very strong attitude that I should lose weight. But if they think that they have no willpower, they basically figure, if there's a cupcake in front of me, I'm going to eat it. They have very little perceived behavioral control. So in that case, the attitude alone is not going to survive, the strong subjective norms not to diet, and the poor perception of your own self-efficacy, your own ability to diet, which means that even the intentions are unlikely to fire off. Now, let's switch that around. You have a strong attitude that you want to diet and lose some weight. The subjective norms are that all your friends have recently taken up dieting, they've taken up CrossFit, they're very much getting into a healthier way of life, and you're just going along. That's a great thing. And finally, perceived behavioral control. You've gained weight in the past, but you've also dieted successfully in the past, and you know that if you set your mind to it, you can lose the weight. In that case, now you probably have very strong intentions. And intentions are kind of like strategies. They're above and beyond the attitude. It's not, I just want to lose weight. Now you have intentions. I'm going to go to the gym 5 times a week. I'm going to only drink an energy shake in the mornings, and I'm going to stop eating red meat and potatoes and start eating rice and chicken for dinner. And then, now that you have those strategies, you're much more likely to do the behavior. So if you want to change a behavior, what this theory says is that it's not just the attitudes. You need to change the attitudes of the person. You need to make sure the subjective norms or the social situation around the person supports that new attitude, and that person perceives they can affect the situation. In that case, you're much more likely to see the behaviors. So in other words, if we change someone's job satisfaction, we make them love their job. We work hard on it. But they're the only person in their department that loves their job. The subjective norms is to hate the job. And they don't perceive they have any real control over their job. In other words, their perceived behavioral control is, my performance is pretty much set by those around me. There's no way I can increase it. In that case, job satisfaction would have no real impact on increasing performance, a behavior. Again, let's turn it around. You do interventions that result in someone having their job satisfaction go up. They like their job, they're very satisfied with their job. And everyone in their department is also satisfied with their job. And you've given them control over their performance to where more work will result in more performance. There you've got positive attitudes, positive subjective norms, and positive perceived behavioral control. Most likely the person will then create strategies and plans to increase their performance. You see that behavior at the end. So let's talk about job satisfaction first. It's probably the most studied, in fact, it is the most studied attitude in the workplace. An enormous amount of research has gone into this, and mainly because it's been very lucrative. In other words, the studies that have looked at job satisfaction have found very successful ways to measure it. They've found very successful ways to change it, in other words, antecedents, and they've found solid evidence that it has large-ranging impact on organizations, consequences. So our definition, pleasurable, positive emotional state resulting from the cognitive appraisal of one's job and job experiences. So it stems from our perception that our jobs are fulfilling. So that isn't the only thing that can result in job satisfaction, but generally what we find is the more someone thinks of their job as their career, the more that someone thinks of their job as it's an important part of who I am, and the work I do is satisfying and fulfilling, the higher their levels of job satisfaction are going to be. And again, having high job satisfaction, it feels good, it's pleasurable, it's not just a positive emotional state, I like my job, it's also, I enjoy the fact that I have this job. There is also a part of that definition, the cognitive appraisal. And what this says is that job satisfaction is an emotional response. However, it is somewhat driven from cognitive higher order processing. In other words, everyone tends to look at their job and their job experiences and decides, is this a good job or not? Am I enjoying what's going on? Do I like the hours? Do I like my coworkers? And based on these cognitive appraisals, we can have higher or lower job satisfaction. Now, those cognitive appraisals are perceptions, which means that you can have a situation where you have done everything right to try to increase job satisfaction, but if the employee still perceives the workplace as unfair and toxic or hostile, that's not going to have an effect. So a part of job satisfaction is also very individual, how the person is perceiving what's going on. So let's look at the model. So the framework for job satisfaction, and as I kind of alluded to at the start of this lecture, whenever we see these frameworks, we're going to see a lot on the left, antecedents, causes, and a lot on the right, consequences. And they're all funneling through this construct, the attitude, job satisfaction. So when we're looking at job satisfaction, the middle purple box, part of that process then is the measurement of those dimensions. So how do we measure job satisfaction? And we're going to talk about some of those measures later. But let's start now with just the antecedents. So there's 4 broad clusters of things that multiple studies and multiple environments and cultures and organizations have found do result in an increase in job satisfaction. The first one is the same thing we were actually talking about as far as things that increase motivation as well, and that's the job characteristics. So if you remember from the motivation theory or motivation lecture, we were talking about job characteristics theory. The idea that you can increase motivation by making jobs more intrinsically or internally motivating by making them more interesting. So job characteristics include skill variety, task identity. So again, how many different skills do you have to do? Task identity, how clearly identified are those tasks? Task significance, so how clear is it that the tasks that you do actually result in the organization succeeding? Autonomy, how much control you have over the work you do. Job feedback, so how much actual information you get about your performance. And we've got another one in there, stress and workload. And each one of these antecedents will sometimes have some negatives in there too. So the more stress and the higher the workload, that's going to have a negative effect on job satisfaction. So if you want to design a job to where that job is likely to not only increase internal motivation, but also result in higher job satisfaction in most people, you want to make sure there's a decent amount of skill variety, that the skills and tasks necessary to do the job are clearly identified, that those tasks that are resulting in the job are clearly connected to the organizational goals in a way that the employee can see, that the employee has some autonomy in determining how they actually can get their job done, they get solid management and feedback telling them when they're doing well or how to correct it if they're doing poorly, and finally that the job is relatively low stress with a reasonable workload. Individual personal characteristics. A fair amount of research has also found that job satisfaction is possibly a stable trait. What this is that basically people that have high job satisfaction tend to have higher job satisfaction in any type of environment. In other words, if you take someone that was in a very poorly designed job before, low skill variety, low task identity, low task significance, not much autonomy, bad job feedback, and fairly high stress and workload, that person will probably have slightly lower job satisfaction, but that individual may still be fairly more satisfied with that job than other people working that job. You then move them into a job that has been designed to be higher in job satisfaction. Their job satisfaction will move up, but if you moved everyone from their previous job where they were at the highest level of job satisfaction, even though that job satisfaction was relatively low, and everyone has moved into these redesigned jobs that are made to increase job satisfaction, everyone's job satisfaction will go up, but the person that was the highest in the poor job will probably still be the highest in the well-designed job. So that indicates that there's something internal about job satisfaction. And research has found that various affective dispositions, some people are born with what's called, basically are not born with, but definitely develop positive affect. They look at the world in a positive light. Those people tend to be higher in job satisfaction no matter what the job they have. And some people have negative affect. They tend to look at the world in terms of negative events, and they kind of focus on the bad things in life. They're tending to have lower job satisfaction, again, no matter what kind of job. There's been some research that's found that even genetics, so this is twin studies that have found that identical twins raised in very different environments tend to be more alike in their levels of job satisfaction across jobs than people that are not genetically related. And finally, self-esteem, so our general feeling about ourselves, is also not tied directly to job satisfaction. So again, someone with high self-esteem in a poor job will probably have equal or maybe even higher job satisfaction than someone with low self-esteem in a well-designed job. Social factors include supervisor relationships, coworker relationships, role variables, the type of role you have in an organization, and also perceptions of organizational justice. So that this is the bigger picture. So the first set of antecedents, job characteristics, is the actual physical structure of the job. The next one, individual personal characteristics, is the internal traits of the person. Social factors is kind of the social environment and organizational environment that the job takes place in a broader context. And finally, we have growth opportunities. Basically, so above and beyond everything else we've talked about, the more opportunities there are for promotion, merit pay and benefits, and additional benefits for work, family issues, and balance, again, all of those result in greater job satisfaction. And the higher the job satisfaction, we generally find both task and contextual, so we're now on the right side of the diagram, the consequences. Performance tends to go up for both task and OCBs, or contextual behavior. We tend to see a reduction in withdrawal behaviors that includes leaving the organization, being late, being absent, and also a reduction in counterproductive behaviors, including theft, sabotage, and aggression. So we're going to talk a little bit more on each of those job characteristics and antecedents. The first one, again, was job characteristics. So this basically includes Hackman and Oldham's job characteristic theory and their core job dimensions that we talked about in the motivation chapter, but it also adds stress and workload. And research has demonstrated consistent relationships between employees' perceptions of their job characteristics and job satisfaction. Now notice that's an important little caveat in that statement. Employees' perceptions of their job characteristics. So what exactly is a well-designed job? How many skills need to be there? How much feedback needs to be there? Basically, what that perceptions means is that when you create a job that matches an employee's desires or want for a varied job. In other words, there's not too many skills being used, there's not too little. The tasks are well identified, but not too identified. There's autonomy, but not too much autonomy. There's feedback, but not too little or too much. It's when there's a good fit between the actual job design, the core job dimensions, and the person's perceptions of what a good job looks like. That's when you find that strong relationship with job satisfaction. So meta-analyses of this relationships have ranged from about 0.32 to 0.46. So these are R's, correlations. So the correlation between core job dimensions at the lowest, task identity, so how clearly identified the tasks are related, about an R of 0.32. So remember, if you want to talk about percentage of variance explained, you multiply R by itself, so 0.32 times 0.32, a little over 9%. So about 9% of job satisfaction is explained by task identity. The more task identity, the higher the job satisfaction. And the highest of those core job dimensions is autonomy with 0.46. So somewhere around 15% of job satisfaction is being explained by how much autonomy or control you have over your job. Individual characteristics, so some people tend to be satisfied with their jobs over the course of careers, while others are dissatisfied. Again, if we actually just track people going from job to job to job, in other words, we're not looking at their job satisfaction at any one job, we're actually getting a measure over multiple time points of just on average what is their job satisfaction. We actually find that though there is some variance, that would be variance being explained, for example, by job characteristics, social factors, and other things, there seems to also be some stability in job satisfaction. And I can say for myself that I've generally been fairly satisfied with most of the jobs I've had. There's been a few that I've not been satisfied with, but in those jobs I can honestly say I was probably more satisfied than others. So I worked for construction in the construction industry for about 5 years, and I found the work somewhat repetitive occasionally. It definitely was very physically demanding, and it definitely was not very intellectually engaging. Mainly because I was basically a grunt worker in a construction company. I really wasn't being allowed to do much more than, do this job for 8 hours solid and let us know when you're done. But I looked at the positive. I'm outdoors, I'm working with my hands. At the end of the day, I can see what I've done. So I tended to be satisfied. And for a little while, I actually delivered pizzas. And when I did, I worked for a horrible boss, for a horrible company. They treated people just horribly. Incredibly low pay, insultive. They'd yell at you. I only had the job for about a month and I left, but I actually stayed longer than a lot of people because I just let it roll off my back. So I had lower job satisfaction, but I probably had higher job satisfaction than almost anyone else at that company. This is an indication of an affective disposition, a tendency to respond to a whole class of environmental stimuli in a predetermined affect-based way. And again, generally speaking, this is drawing from personality psychology and also a bit of clinical psychology, the idea of positive and negative affect. That people tend to look at the world from a framework of, are they trying to focus on the positive, or are they trying to focus on the negative, or are they more balanced between the two? And what we find is that if you find someone that rates very highly on positive affect, they frame the world in the terms of positive events. They tend to remember positive events better. They tend to look for positive events. They look for the silver lining on the cloud, so to speak. Those people generally tend to have higher job satisfaction. People with negative affect, they tend to frame the world as far as the negative events. They attend more to negative events in their life. They remember negative events a little bit easier. They're basically always looking for the shadow on a sunny day. Those people tend to have slightly lower job satisfaction, no matter what the job. Now, all of these individual characteristics are still affectable by the other antecedents. So you take someone with negative affect, but give them a really good job, solid social support, and lots of growth opportunities, you will still see their job satisfaction go up. It's just the baseline of where their job satisfaction is different. Avery and colleagues in 1989 did a whole series of twin studies looking at the genetics and did find a relationship that, again, basically, as I said, when you looked at identical twins that were raised separately, so they were in very different environments, when you actually looked at the relationship between their job satisfaction, in other words, how related it was, how similar the job satisfaction of genetically identical twins raised in separate environments were, they were actually fairly related. In other words, if you found these two twins over here both have high job satisfaction. These two twins over here both have low job satisfaction. Usually their job satisfactions were very close to each other. Compared to if you just grab two people that are not genetically related and compare their job satisfaction levels, you'll often find them vastly different. This person has very low job satisfaction, this person has very high. That's an indicator of a little bit of a genetic component. And there's also been studies that have found that there is a genetic component to personality and there's a genetic component to positive and negative affect. So we're probably capturing that same concept of the individual does matter. And finally, self-esteem and core self-evaluations relate to both job and life satisfaction. So what that's referring to is self-esteem is your overall self-appraisal. Same with core self-evaluations. It basically means, at the most simplest of levels, do you actually like yourself and like how you behave in the world? If you like who you are, you're more likely to be have higher job satisfaction in general. Again, regardless of the job. Also, organizational-based self-esteem. In other words, not just your self-esteem about yourself broadly, but what do you think about your own success in your organization? So if you have organizational-based self-esteem, it basically means I feel good about what I do, and I feel good about how I do it, and I feel as if I can get things done. That's also strongly related to job satisfaction, an R of 0.58. So explaining almost 28%, about close to a third of job satisfaction is directly related to your own self-evaluation of your success in your job. Antecedent social factors. So relationships with managers and coworkers are very important. Research supports these influence. So again, the better the relationship you have with upper management and the people that are actually basically your bosses, generally the higher the job satisfaction. So that's something definitely that organizations can think about. How do we increase the interaction, the positive interaction between managers and subordinates, and also coworkers? And probably all of you can think of a situation you've been in where you may have not been in a great job, but you liked the people you worked with. In that situation, quite honestly, you'll probably have higher job satisfaction because you're drawing it from that social interaction with the coworkers. And some of us probably have, and myself included, can think of a situation where we had a really good job, but the coworker situation made it very unpleasant. I actually worked briefly at another university where the atmosphere amongst the faculty was very caustic. Basically, it was a department that was low on funds, and any faculty member that managed to get any kind of external grant or funding was then given all of the benefits of basically the department. So there was a constant competition with everyone in that department to get the next big grant, because whoever got the grant would also get the office space and the graduate assistance that the department had. And if you didn't have a grant, you didn't get any space, any support, any help at all. So though the job that I did, teaching and research, is what I love to do and what I'm continuing to do here at SIUE, the coworkers there really is what made it unpleasant. Social roles, so ambiguity negatively affects job satisfaction. So if you don't know where you are, basically social roles is the unofficial positions we may have in any social group. So leadership can be a social role. Sometimes it's an official role, I'm the boss, but amongst peers, there's often a couple people that kind of take on that leader role. That's a social role. Sometimes there's a support role, the person in a group of people that basically is making sure that everyone's happy. That's a social role. Sometimes there is the person that everyone picks on, the omega, if you would, from kind of a wolf pack. So think of a wolf pack. You have your alpha, your leader, your beta, the person that supports the leader, your regular wolves, and then you have your omega, the kind of wolf that everyone picks on. So if you know your social role, different social roles may also have an effect on job satisfaction, but ambiguity, if you're not sure where you fit, if you're still struggling to figure out, am I the leader, am I the second in command, am I a follower, am I a supporter, am I basically the scapegoat, that situation actually has a negative effect on job satisfaction. Once people are comfortable in their social roles, it has less of an impact on job satisfaction. And finally, perceptions of organizational justice. So perceptions of fairness does affect attitudes, behaviors, and performance. So do you believe the organization is just and behaves in a just way? And we're going to talk about organizational justice a little bit later in this chapter. And finally, we have antecedents, growth opportunities. So employees' perceptions that there is a potential to grow, advance, or be promoted. So being paid well, provided excellent benefits, opportunities to advance. Pay for performance increases job satisfaction. In other words, you got a base rate, but you also get bonuses if you overperform or outperform. Attitudes about pay relate to job satisfaction as well. So if you are generally positive about your pay rate, you're going to have higher job satisfaction. If you're negative about your pay rate, you're going to have lower job satisfaction. And again, in the motivation theory, we talked about kind of motivators and hygienes, and that pay was a hygiene. And that pay didn't result in more job satisfaction, but lower than expected pay results in dissatisfaction. And we see that same kind of research here when we talk about job satisfaction. Now, growth opportunities can conflict with non-work life. So work-life conflict is negatively related to job satisfaction. The more someone feels that their job actively impedes or conflicts with the rest of their life, that results in lower job satisfaction. So providing a lot of growth opportunities, especially if they're kind of expected, can actually end up having a negative effect on job satisfaction. So what that might look like is that if the main growth opportunity is, we will give you additional pay if you outperform these goals, but the only way you can outperform these goals is you need to come in extra hours. You need to be coming in on weekends. You need to be coming in on your time off. You need to be going on business trips and going out to client sites, and all of that isn't being allowed. You can't take that out of your regular 40-hour work week. It's got to come out of your family time, your home time, your alone time, your life time. That can actually result in having a negative effect on job satisfaction. So you have to be a little careful with how you integrate these growth opportunities.